could everyone take their seats, please? Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session. Let me kick off, if I may, by introducing myself. So I'm Kath Bremner, Impact Asset Manager's Chief Strategy and Operations Officer. And I'm delighted to be at this Chatham House conference on green accountability and climate finance. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I've been working in sustainability for some 25 years. And it's when Creon said, I'm putting this together, would you be interested in chairing a keynote panel with Nigel and Henry? I said, absolutely. Particularly as my previous role in the UK government was heading up the climate finance team in BEIS, and it's great to see some fellow compatriots, shall we say, looking at these issues very carefully in the lead up to COP26 when the UK hosted it. So for today's keynote, we're going to hear from two speakers very versed in the detail of these issues, both nationally and internationally. And so we're going to hear from Henry Gonzalez and Nigel Topping. From Henry first. I don't know if his title was wrong, but he's actually the Green Finance Deputy Executive Director and Interim Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, with over 25 years of professional experience across sustainable and impact investing, emerging markets, and political and economic development. He was an Associate Professor Fellow at Oxford University's Sayre Business School. He also served as a member of a Senior Management and Global Head and Research Advisory at Responsibility Investments AG. So we'll turn to Henry first, and then Nigel Topping will take the chair. He was appointed as the UK Prime Minister, UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP26. In his role, Nigel mobilised global private sector and local government to take bold action on climate change, launching the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience campaigns with Mark Carney and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. If I could turn to Henry first to kick us off, and then to Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and great to be joined by Nigel in this keynote remarks in the Chatham House on the subject of green accountability and climate finance. It was right before COP26 that I had the chance to meet Nigel here in Seoul, and we were discussing a lot of things around private sector and mobilization for climate finance. And fast forward now almost 2 years, we're now having this conversation on where the journey is, and we would like to see that journey going. What I'd like to do in the next 10 to 12 minutes is just to provide some background on some of the issues that the Green Climate Fund sees in the climate finance architecture, and how accountability, transparency, and impact are very important aspects of that. I think it is clear that we're not on track to deliver the climate transformation we need in developing countries. However, we remain optimistic and we remain hopeful. To avoid the catastrophic climate change, we indeed require the adoption of climate technologies and business models that require a new way of doing business. And that would also require a lot of capital. And the IPCC does provides those estimates in the $1.6 to $3.8 trillion in new climate investments that are needed annually through 2050 to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees. An additional 140 to 300 billion is needed annually to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So those figures are indeed far from some of the progress that we see, but indeed there is momentum, and we should continue with that. Barriers are in place that unfortunately are not allowing us to bring some of those climate solutions that are needed. And transparency and accountability are some of those barriers. In these remarks, I would first briefly explain GCF's mandate just to make sure that everyone understands how we're working. And then we will look into how transparency and accountability could help reduce these barriers, de risk investment, and help to deliver that climate ambition. The Green Climate Fund has a mandate to support developing countries in the transition to low emission and climate resilient development. We finance projects through a flexible range of financial instruments, including grants, debt, private equity, guarantees, and other capital market instruments. We are committed to a 50-50 balance between financing mitigation and adaptation projects. And we have a mandate to particularly support the most vulnerable. In here, it will be least developed countries, small island development states, and African states. Over half of our adaptation funding goes to this group of countries. GCF was founded as a partnership organization, and we serve as a hub of climate finance architecture. We co invest climate initiatives originated by over 200 public and private partner agencies and firms ranging from some of the largest commercial banks to NGOs, governments, impact investors, and private equity shops. We have already financed 216 different projects for around $12 billion of our committed capital. But if we take into account the capital that will be co invested, we have a portfolio of around $45 billion. As of now, we will be going to the next board meeting in July where we have another set of 12 new projects that we're going to be financing for the total of $750 million. With our partners, we aim to catalyze climate finance at scale, and we are focusing four work streams that we believe will help us deliver on our mission. The first is on the policy side. We would like to create an enabling environment for climate action by supporting integrated climate strategies and investment plans at the country level through different programs of readiness, technical assistance, and capacity building. On our second stream, we are trying to accelerate climate innovation through investments in new and innovative technologies, business models, financial instruments, and practices. Thirdly, and the most focus of our different prongs is the de-risking through blended finance. We would like to be the first mover in these investments to allow to really accelerate and create the new frontier of climate solutions in order to establish a commercial track record in crowding private finance. In this area, we are working closely with some of the IFIs or DFIs or MDBs that are present at this moment in this conversation, but we also are working with local private sector and global private providers and asset owners that are also hoping to help us greening the financial system. A major challenge in de-risking is the level of sovereign debt in many countries, which leads sometimes to commercial lending only being available at a very high interest rate, which makes private sector investments unfeasible. So we try to increase access to the international capital markets as well, and we would like to encourage local finance in developing countries to be aligned with sustainable development and other taxonomy. That is why our final work stream is actually focused on aligning finance with sustainability. This is by promoting the mainstreaming of climate risks in decision making and enabling financial institutions, mostly those serving the micro, small, and medium enterprises, as well as development banks, to finance the widespread adoption of commercially proven new climate solutions through dedicated lines of credit or support to access to capital. Now, when we look at those four different prongs, we do see barriers and we try to address those barriers. Climate solutions usually require higher upfront capital and longer payback period when compared to conventional approaches. This is particularly the case for climate resilient infrastructure investments. But there are barriers to securing the upfront financing needs as well, especially for innovative solutions. These barriers exist at each stage of the innovation cycle, either at the emergence, deployment, and market adoption of new climate solutions. These barriers provide perceived or real higher risks in relation to policy and regulation, as well as operational and technical risk, and finally, higher market and socioeconomic risks. These risks are exacerbated when there are issues related to transparency, accountability, or integrity. Together, this creates a lack of access to affordable long term climate project finance in developing countries. Risk in itself is not unsurmountable. We are indeed able to de-risk, and the Green Climate Fund has a very high risk tolerance based on the guidance from our board. The private sector is used to pricing risk into its investment decisions in the best way it can, but pricing risk requires transparency and information for investors as well as accountability. Allow me to say a little about how GCF is increasing accountability and transparency through our operations. One of the key differentiators of GCF to promote accountability and transparency is through the principle of country ownership. All GCF projects must be endorsed at the country level through a non-objection letter from the country concerned, which ensures that climate actions are aligned with the country priorities and NDCs. And this provides a transparency that will allow to understand how we're going to plan the project, how we're going to execute the project at the country level right before it is even approved by our board. Our board is another example of how we are strengthening accountability and transparency. We are governed by an equal number of representatives from developing and developed countries who make decisions largely through consensus and in public. Our board meetings are all live streamed, and we also give a strong role to civil society with a network of over 300 organizations with observer status to GCF, which are represented to our board by 4 representatives, 2 as active observers from the CSOs, the civil society organizations, and 2 from the private sector. Decisions are taken by the board on funding are made public, and you can all track the details and progress of each one of our 216 projects on our website through our data library. We're also transparent about our review processes and how we make assessment or how we look into appraisal of our projects. More recently, we were able to publish our appraisal guidelines explaining how we review and evaluate our proposals. And this is quite a radical exercise in transparency because it's showing our stakeholders exactly what are we looking at when we make investment decisions, and also what is the climate impact potential that we are seeking through all projects funded by the GCF. Once adopted, it is important that we are accountable for the effective use of our public funds for climate action. We are a public investor that is trying to play a role in blended finance by crowding in private and larger public investors. We do this through a comprehensive process of monitoring and evaluations, both by the Secretariat, but also by the Independent Evaluation Unit, which produces its own reports. When a project is at risk of failing off track, we have a system of adaptive management to work closely with the entities that are accredited to the GCF to make changes necessary. This provides flexibility while ensuring the projects have the greatest possible climate impact, but it is something that we need to have to deploy extensively over the past 3 years as the impacts of the COVID pandemic created implementation challenges for projects around the world. Protection from integrity risk is also key. As an organization which works through its partners to implement projects, GCF undertakes different levels of due diligence and appraisal, something that we call lines of defense. Our primary due diligence and appraisal is an extensive process undertaken by the origination organizations, in this case, what we call accredited entities. They need to document, assess, and verify the details of the investment and financing opportunities being proposed. We ensure that they have the capacity to undertake this due diligence on our behalf, and we do an accreditation system that is quite thorough in order to make sure that we understand the fiduciary risks as well as the standards on transparency and accountability. It also assesses the project management systems that these entities have, and they have oversight and control on how it manages its risks. This is our first line of defense. Then we have 2 other lines of defense. First, we have internal controls and oversight function that ensures the funding proposals comply with the GCF strategic objectives, investment policies, environmental and social safeguards, risk management, gender, and indigenous peoples policies. And finally, We have the independent units as our third line of defense, and our internal audit independently verify and validate the effectiveness of the other two lines of defense. Those units include our independent integrity unit, which is an independent unit of the GCF Secretariat and reports directly to the board. And this unit is responding not only on integrity evaluations, but is also working proactively by identifying risks in what they call proactive integrity review, where they are taking a major step forward in preventing and not just responding to integrity risks. They should play a role in increasing the confidence of all stakeholders, including our co-investors. GCF mandate is a challenging one. We're working with some of the world's most vulnerable countries, least developed countries, states, and African states. Our role is to help them deliver the climate solutions they need, but we also need to ensure that our public funds are being used catalytically with additionality and the greatest possible impact that really takes into account the mere topic of this session around accountability and transparency. To finish, this accountability is particularly key for us this year. We are engaged in the replenishment drive to secure funds for our next 4-year programming cycle of 2024-2027. We are hoping that by demonstrating how we are accountable in the use of these funds, we will receive support from our contributors in order for us to push forward our agenda of climate finance. So far, we are receiving strong signals from our contributors who want to have ambitious replenishment. Recently, Germany was the first of our large contributors who pledged a $2 billion pledge for the next replenishment period of the GCF, which represents a 33% increase of their commitment last time. We're confident that our approach to accountability, transparency, and climate impact means that we will be able to secure those resources we need so that GCF can provide even more support for developing countries in order to reach their climate ambitions. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and happy to answer any questions you may have. Back to you, Kat.
Henry, thank you very much for that really detailed account of the GCF's, focus on transparency. And I can say, having been previously involved heavily in supporting the GCF with the UK government, we had many discussions about boards and oversight and country ownership actually of projects, and that transparency that the GCF has enshrined in its whole governance is really key. I'm going to hand it over to Nigel now, if I may. And also, Henry, thank you for joining us in Seoul at a very late hour for you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to Chatham House and to the World Bank for convening such a rich conversation, and thanks to all the speakers and panelists and to everybody participating. I'm not an expert in international climate finance, so I'm learning a lot. You described my background. One thing I would say in my last 3 years in the role, working with two other climate champions, one from Chile and one from Egypt, I've become more and more aware of and obsessed by the need to mobilise the 2.4 trillion. In fact, that number itself comes from the paper which Mahmoud and I commissioned from Nick Stern and Vera Songway. So I'm not representing a specific institution now, so I'm going to make some reflections on the conversation I've heard this morning, but unashamedly based on my experience, which is more about the transparency of corporate commitments than the transparency around climate finance, but hopefully there's some overlap. So I'm going to address 4 themes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of civil society, the importance of being rigorous in the way we think and speak about the future. I'm going to make a plea for what I call attention symmetry, and then I'm going to talk a bit about Goodhart's law. So the role of civil society. I love the last panel because it really brought out the importance of recognising that civil society is not one thing, it's very diverse. So my 2 observations about civil society are, please let's not play out the life of Brian seen in the Colosseum over and over again, and let's learn how to spot the pivot point. So the life of Brian, I'm sorry to pick on the comments earlier about GFANs, but I think they were illustrated really well how a sort of life of Brian diagnosis can be unhelpful. To say that the reason insurers are leaving the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which is part of GFANs, is because of a flaw in the Net Zero Insurance Alliance thinking or design is frankly baffling to me. It was designed very carefully with UNEP FI, led by a chair who is a lawyer, to try and address antitrust considerations up front, and it's fall victim not of bad design but of mad US politics and actually unhelpful antitrust law in terms of what antitrust law seeks to do and how it is blind to the difference between collaboration for public good and collaboration for public bad. So we should be very careful as civil society organisations before we start throwing stones at other civil society organisations. It's something that we can sometimes be very good at without even bothering to do our research on those other organisations or even talk to them. So there's a plea for a bit more solidarity, respect and conversation. So let me talk, the next point is about spotting the pivot point. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I spent a lot of time in the Carbon Disclosure Project and then founding the Science Based Targets Initiative. And then with the race to zero, suddenly we have all this criticism of net zero commitments. And we're 25 years into civil society running the show in terms of accountability. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I think, about 1998. CDP was formed in 2000. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board in 2007, that basically became TCFD. Science-Based Targets Initiative in 2013, the Race to Zero 2020, Net Zero Banking Initiative in 2021, which meant that those members were finally publishing science-based, publicly accountable targets in 2022. So we shouldn't be creating a circular firing squad and attacking all of that. But instead, we should be saying that shows great momentum. It needs to be regulated, and it needs to be regulated fast. We could spend 10 years wasted energy focusing on making the already good perfect, but not actually achieving systems change because we don't get regulation. So let's make sure we spot the point when the civil society work's basically been done and it has to be taken up by regulation. Second point about how we think about the future, George Soros talks about our reflexive relationship with the future. You know, the way that we think about the future affects the decisions we make today. And I see often in the global finance system around climate change two flaws of our thinking about the future, which we need to call out and help correct. One assumes that the future, one is a failure to realise how bad things are going to get, and the other one is a failure to realise how good things are going to get. So I better pass those because they don't apply to the same situations. So the failure to realise how bad things are going to get is baked into so many mechanisms and structures which assume a kind of null counterfactual, that the risk profile of the future is the same as the risk profile as the past. That's obviously stupid, it's obviously wrong, but it's still the basis of most credit assessments, whether it comes to individual investments or to credit ratings. So that needs to be called out, and you have to get into the details of the mechanics like the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment has done in terms of providing a kind of negative counterfactual of the deteriorating risk profile against which the investment is being made. That matters for obvious reasons, right? If the counterfactual of what happens if you don't invest is worse, then it improves the investment case of when you do invest. The other mistake about thinking about the future is underestimating how good things are going to get. And this we see particularly in normative signals around technology adoption, which is always faster than Bloomberg New Energy Finance or the IEA predict. I mean, just this week, or last week, the latest figures around electric vehicle adoption, 68% growth, 200% growth in India, Southeast Asia, around about 100% in Japan and China. That's way more than doubling every 2 years, and still we have these kind of floppy, rising every year, but still not reflecting the S-curve that we know. The best work done there is by RMI, showing that we'll be above 80% by 2030. Third is a plea for what I call the symmetry of attention. You know, there's this famous phrase in the media that if it bleeds, it leads. That's for the media, for front page article writers, right? That's not an instruction to civil society to only focus on the negative. And it's not that we only focus on the negative, but we get sucked in a little bit to that. And that can lead to a skill at admiring the problems or saying how bad things are rather than getting to the specificity of solutions. And I hear that a little bit when I hear DRC used as a proxy for all emerging markets. I'm like, please, can we not be that lazy? Right, there's a huge scope of institutional capability and risk profiles in even the 54 countries in Africa. So let's not paint a picture which is inaccurate. Let's use the data that Catherine used about actual default rates being lower in Africa than in other regions. Let's talk about, in terms of this symmetry, let's talk about what's working well and draw attention to it, not just about what's not working. Let's talk about the sustainability linked bond in Uruguay, which attracted 40 new foreign investors. Let's talk about the Vumbuzi fund, which Fanny Lautier is launching, which has a very smart use of guarantees. Let's talk about the the policy reform which Rwanda did to enable the massive investment in Coco's clean cook stoves at no cost to the fiscus. There are good examples everywhere of people solving problems, and if we can solve it in one place, we can solve it everywhere. So instead of talking always about how awful the problem is, we talk about how great the solutions are. We draw more attention to them. And this really matters because allocators of capital in the private markets and policymakers are two groups of people who are very much drawn towards success and shy away from failure. So if all they hear is, and it's a bit like the conversation earlier about corruption, if all they hear is climate failure, climate risk, then the default will always be, okay, I'm not going to try anything. So you need to make sure we're exciting people with innovative solutions that are working and attracting more people towards them. Final point is on Goodhart's law, which is with my good friend Mahmoud Mahidin explained to me, is when a measure becomes the target, then it ceases to be a good measure. In other words, be careful, smart people gaming the system. So if disclosure is the target, you'll get disclosure, but you won't necessarily get systems change. If 100 billion is the target, you might get 100 billion, but you won't get systems change. You won't get 2.4 trillion. We heard earlier, if a corruption commission becomes the target, we'll get a corruption commission, but we won't get a reduction in corruption. So we need to somehow keep coming back to taking a holistic view of what's needs to happen. Of course, no one can act holistically. We can only work on one thing at a time. But when we get too focused on one measure, we lose the big picture. And so yes, now we need MDB reform, and it's good to see some convergence of thinking around that. But we need much broader international financial architecture reform. You know, the insurance system globally is completely broken. The incentives are all wrong. You see people now just withdrawing insurance, put prices up, withdraw. No incentive to actually structurally reduce risk. Stock exchange listing requirements still do nothing like an adequate job of requiring transparency over the risks of fossil fuel reserves. Basel III has rules which specifically penalise companies for investing in non-OECD companies by requiring twice the capital coverage. And on and on and on. And Steve Waygood is always reminding us that we need to think much more broadly than MDBs to all of the regulatory functions. So to close, this is a systemic problem. And if your mind's not blown by this morning and how complex and multifaceted it is, then you probably weren't paying attention, or you're much further ahead of me in understanding things. It clearly requires radical collaboration. It requires a focus on specific solutions, and it does require a positive can-do mindset. This point about the conversation will be better if you have different stakeholders in the room. Yes, there's a role for stakeholder alliances, like the private sector saying what MDBs should do, or MDBs saying what national governments should do, or civil society saying what private sector to do. There's a role for that, because it's about getting a campaign sorted out. But the problems are too complicated to be solved by any group alone, and we really saw that last year when Mahmoud and I, with partners in the UN Economic Commissions, held a series of finance roundtables, actually trying to force public and private together and discovering that that just isn't happening enough. So it's not just civil society not in those conversations, it's sometimes just the private sector aren't involved early enough in the design of projects. Sometimes that's because of public sector mistrust of the private sector. Sometimes it's because of MDBs trying to hog the pipeline. But if we don't get all groups together to problem solve, and there's some lovely anecdotes which I'd share if I have more time. And this, my final point is about positivity, which I mentioned earlier. So those are all reasons why next week we'll be launching the Climate Finance Mobilisation Accelerator with Catherine Kaufman from DBSA, who was mentioned as my co-chair, to focus on how do we actually make pipelines a dynamic thing, not just pretend it's a notice board where you post things and hope someone comes along. How do we really focus on the solutions that we know exist and promote them at much more scale and tell the stories of how they're working? And how do we convene together as different stakeholders from ministries of finance, from industry, from allocators of capital, from civil society, to roll our sleeves up and problem solve. Because if we don't deliver what President Ruto calls climate positive development, then we all know the counterfactual there is very bad. Thank you.
Yeah. So look, hard to sum up what was two terrific speakers from Henry and Nigel, but I thought I'd just share a few reflections. Having run climate finance with the UK government, we were accounted for and audited regularly. And, you know, we were reasonably good at identifying what was public and private, the type of financial instrument, the country, the technology, the carbon savings even per year and annual. But if I could just draw on some of what you've both touched on, two key issues I see for carbon, accounting and transparency, particularly in the developing world context, is leverage. So, if you think about the government climate finance, pound or dollar, 100 billion sounds like a lot, but it's nothing compared to the 2.4 trillion or what's needed in resilience terms. And we always struggle with that question was the grant funding that government was providing or concessional loans really being leveraged into the right instruments and vehicles where it was most needed? And so I think transparency around those decisions and why is really key, because it is easier to put senior debt into an instrument or loan finance. But does that really address an insurance gap, a tail risk? New thinking in this area is going to be what's needed if we're going to address. The second is, having been involved in the climate space for 20, 25 years, I'm increasingly of the view that every net zero plan needs to be net zero resilient and probably nature positive, though we've got to define what that means. Why do I say that? Is because we're at 1.1 degrees. We're likely, unfortunately, to hit 1.5 in the next 5 years, and we'll exceed it, which means we have to come back to net zero at some stage, which means you'll need, CCUS, negative emissions. What I don't see is really good transparency on adaptation and resilience in anyone's accounting. The 10 energy efficiency measures, we know what we need to do in energy, electric vehicles. It's an extremely hard infrastructure challenge. But when you're making those infrastructure decisions now, it needs to, if you're pouring concrete that lasts longer than 10 years, you've got to decide, is that concrete got to last in 40-degree heat, in a flood, in a cyclone? If you're not making that decision at the same time, then there's a problem. And, I think in the developing country context, sub-Saharan Africa, when I hear the Indonesian energy minister say we'll have wet bulb temperatures 40 days a year and only 6% of the country has air conditioning, that's a real problem. That's a humanitarian aid crisis. So, one thing I would urge as you think about these frameworks is we've got the greenhouse gas protocol. I completely agree with you, Nigel. We've been doing it for years, but we don't have the similar thing for resilience planning. And I think we really need that urgently. We need it large infrastructure, but we need it in small homes. We need it in buildings. We need it in cooling. As you'll hear today, if you're in, I recently appointed to the board of the Met Office, and they have the world's largest physical climate risk. And they're now sending out, heat or humidity warnings, as well as flood warnings. And we need that globally, I think, as part of this challenge. Can I just turn it to the floor for one or two questions? Over to you. Creon, please.
Sorry for jumping in, but firstly, thanks for some really great presentations. I'm really struck by the way in which Henry described the role of an absolutely critical catalytic actor in the space, in the GCF, where obviously a great deal of thought has gone into the issues of accountability and so on. And Nigel, you've described this kind of broader ecosystem in which the GCF is a catalytic actor. My question really is, and it's a kind of question to both, what do you want from each other? Nigel, when you're describing the ecosystem, what do you want from the GCF as a catalytic actor to make your ecosystem work better, if you like? And similarly for Henry, when you're looking at what Nigel's doing in terms of framing that broader ecosystem, what do you really want in order that your catalytic action can be more effective?
Can I just take maybe two, three questions, and then we might. There's one other gentleman here and the lady. Thank you.
Thank you. So for Henry, Andres Falconer here. Hi, Henry. You have a room full of people that are rooting for the GCF and supporting you, but are faced with, they're perplexed with how, we're falling behind. So my question is back to your central point on how transparency and accountability can be supporting climate ambition. Can you be a little bit more specific, more concrete, perhaps even an example to show us how that climate ambition is being leveraged by accountability, rather than simply, as we sometimes hear or fear, creating more obstacles, more compliance hoops we need to jump through and potentially slowing down the process? Thank you.
Great. If I take one more question from this lady at the front.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for these great presentations. I have two quick questions. The first is to you, Nigel. You mentioned that you were impressed by the fact that there was great momentum in the last session around the need for a very vibrant and multi-actor civil society, but that this had reached a moment where it needed to be regulated, if I understood you correctly. Okay, I was wondering about that. So maybe you can just clarify me on that one. And another quick question of clarification goes to you, Henry, which is, you know, we were all very excited when the Green Climate Fund was created. And it brings so much resources and knowledge and support to this agenda. But it's been really difficult, the whole process of accreditation, to participate and benefit from it. So maybe you can say a few words about how you see that easing up, or any changes or reforms that are in mind. Thank you.
Great. Can I pass it over to Henry and Nigel?
Let me deal with the last question first. I made two different points. One was, it's really good to acknowledge just the diversity in civil society, because sometimes it can sound like we're saying civil society is just one of, I think you listed a category of 4, and we could probably list 7 or 8, right? So that was just, I think it's important that we don't think civil society is one thing, just as public sector isn't one thing and private sector isn't one thing. Right? There's complexity and diversity. The point I was making about regulation is that it's important as campaigners to notice the moment when the campaign's basically done its job. So the simple example would be a lot of campaigning is about trying to wake people up to a fact, right? So what you're basically doing is you're shouting at people saying, wake up, the house is on fire, right? And until people wake up, you need to keep shouting or trying different ways of throwing water at them or shaking their beds or flashing lights at them. But when people wake up, you have to notice it. And what often happens is when people, at the moment people wake up, what they get from civil society is, wake up. And they say, no, I'm awake, dude. What do I do? And if the answer is wake up, it's really unhelpful. In fact, it's off-putting. So it's really hard because your identity as a campaigner is often around the campaign, and you need to spot the moment when actually you're winning, and then you have to be courageous enough to reinvent. So when you've got a lot of momentum around voluntary target adoption, you don't need to keep pushing the perfection of that process. You need to push it, use that for political leverage to get it regulated, because there's a limit to what voluntary initiatives can ever do. So I was making 2 quite separate points about diversity and about regulation, not regulation of civil society. I was not talking about that at all.
Okay, great. Henry, can I pass to you?
Sure. Thank you very much. Two very interesting questions. So the first one, what does GCF require from the broader external environment? I think there is a lot of efforts on some of these matters, but a lot of them have been in the capital markets or in the more known asset classes. And I think what sometimes we need is to have certain standards on the private markets, both private debt and private equity, that could also apply across the board, from debt clauses to different type of debt resilient clauses. And I know there are some efforts, and possibly next week in Paris, some of them will be discussed. But I believe that, as GFANS and others have really created that momentum on listed assets, it would be great if we could also move the needle on the private markets, where a lot of emerging markets have perhaps more options, given that their capital markets are still quite in the incipient phase. Great to get that question from Andres, a close friend and someone I admire of his work in accountability. One of the things we really want to do more, and we started doing it, is locally led climate solutions. I think we would like to work with some of those solutions, especially on the most vulnerable. A lot of them are going to be on the early warning systems or on the adaptation elements. And I think a lot of those, you don't really need to bring the solution. There are solutions at that sort of local level, but also engaging all stakeholders. And here, this is something that for us, we are very proud that we as a fund, we also have our own sort of indigenous group that advises some of our work to make sure that we incorporate some of those realities of the local communities. So I think this is an area that we would like to do more. We started doing some of those in the Pacific Islands, and we believe there is room to do a lot more on that. On the last question about the accreditation, so I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the flaws of the GCF design is that we have a one-size-fits-all. And our policies and the way we work apply for a private equity firm that is seeking 350 million of first loss, and is the same thing that a 10 million transaction that we are having. So this reality hopefully will somehow change. One thing that we have recently implemented is to sort of overcome this issue of accreditation that is quite, time consuming and sometimes a burden, is project-based accreditation. So instead of doing accreditation at the institutional level that takes a long time, we're now trying to do 10 transactions a year at least, where we could do project-based accreditation, where we're looking at that project for its own merits. And of course, we would look at the capacity of implementation of the entity, but the idea is for us to expand. Now, one issue of accreditation is not only is our accreditation quite heavy, and the board is really trying to work together with us in making it a lot more, but the other issue is that entities that have been accredited do not bring business to the Green Climate Fund. We have 114 entities accredited, and the 216 projects are only comprised about 55 entities. So half of the entities are not doing their job. They got accredited. I don't know whether they wanted to have that seal of approval or the stamp of approval. And as you know, we are country owned, so we require the countries to push some of those. But we're also now taking into account in the reaccreditation some of those non-performing entities that might come along the way. My son has just crashed my computer. So that's a nice way to end the conversation, Kath.
Well, look, Henry, as I said earlier, you've been amazing in joining us at Seoul in such a late time. I think I'm going to have to wrap up the session there. I'm getting the nod from Queen. Can we give a big round of applause? Thank you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keep enjoying. I wish I were there. Bye-bye.